All right, so we're recording. So this is a class on developing your sound and getting some good tone out of your guitar. Essentially just making sure that your guitar sounds as good as it possibly can and making it unique to what you can do. So we're going to talk about a lot of different factors, got a lot to talk about. All of these factors are going to affect your tone in one way or another. And we're going to talk about what's more important, what's maybe not as important, and all that kind of stuff. As we talk about tone and as you talk about it with other people, you're going to hear lots of different like descriptive words about what tone is. Some popular ones like bright or warm or crisp, essentially we'll think of our tone as a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, we have really bright, crisp, almost harsh sounds. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have really warm, almost really muddy sounds. Okay. And so your guitar tone is going to fall somewhere in between these two spectrums. And neither end is better than the other. They're just different depending on what you want to do, what you're trying to sound like. And we'll see what that sounds like. On the other hand, your tone could also just sound good or not good based on the quality of the tone. For example, if you got some really bad cables and you're not delivering a high quality signal to your amp, it's just not going to sound good. So that's another aspect we have to think about and retaining the quality of our tone. So with that, we'll jump right into it. First off, we're going to be talking about the material of the guitar. So let me ask you guys, do you guys play acoustic guitar or are you electric guitar players? Let me unmute you so I can hear you.
I have both.
Both? Okay.
Both.
Awesome. Okay, so then this will be good for both of you. And for everyone else. So the guitar material, we're talking about like the wood that it's made out of. This is not really that important when it comes to electric guitars. Some might argue that some types of wood for electric guitars helps improve the sustain, but it's not really a major factor in deciding your electric guitar's tone. The acoustic guitar, on the other hand, it's the biggest factor in affecting your tone. So do you guys happen to know off the top of your head what kind of material your guitar is made out of?
I do not.
Yeah, most people don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So one of mine is koa, and the other is mahogany.
Koa is a really pretty wood, actually. Let me share my screen with you. Oh, hold on. Where's the share screen? There it is. Okay. So we're going to go to a website here. We're going to look at a couple different tone woods that they have here. You said you had koa?
And then the other one is mahogany.
Okay. So koa is a Hawaiian one. If you see this little picture, it's got kind of that spectrum I was talking about between warm and bright. It's kind of on the warmer end. It says it's a very beautiful looking wood. I've always wanted a koa guitar, or at least a koa ukulele would be kind of cool. So that's what koa is. And then you said mahogany. Let's see if mahogany's on here. Yep, here's mahogany. Mahogany is also kind of on the warm end, so I guess you like a warmer sound. The guitar I have is zebra wood. You can see it behind me. Zebra wood's a really fun sound, and it just looks really pretty. So I'm not going to go into all the details of all the different types of wood and what they can do, because there's just so many and so many different factors. But one thing you should be aware of is the guitar, the top of the wood, isn't nearly as important as the actual sides and back of the wood. Whatever the sides and back are made out of, that's going to be the main factor in deciding how your guitar is going to sound. And sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's different. The neck doesn't really play a huge factor in deciding your guitar tone, and not even the fretboard. The fretboard doesn't really affect the tone at all, really. The fretboard, some people say, will affect the playability of your instrument, but not necessarily the sound itself. So that's another thing that you can think about. If you play electric guitar, what's going to affect your tone more than the wood is going to be the pickup. The pickup's the absolute most important factor when it comes to electric guitar. And there's two different types of pickups generally that exist. There's single coil and humbucker. What kind of electric guitars do you guys have? Do you know what kind of pickups you got?
Hagstrom.
Hagstrom. Do you know if it has single coil or a humbucker? Do you have any idea?
I don't know.
Okay, no worries.
So on my Fenders, the Strat, the Telly, those are
single coil.
Single coil. but I do have P90s on a casino that are pretty wild.
Yeah, yeah. If you don't know what the difference is between single coil and humbucker pickups, single coils usually have one line of magnets, so they're the thinner pickups, and they can produce an annoying hum at higher volumes. And so because of that, humbucker pickups were invented. A humbucker pickup is basically two single coils put together to kind of neutralize the extra noise. And so single coils are usually used on Fender guitars. Like I said, they're the thinner ones, whilst humbuckers are used more on Gibsons, and they're the thicker, they're twice as big, twice as wide. Single coil for Fender guitars, it produces a brighter, crisper sound, and humbuckers have a little bit of a warmer sound. Single coil is used more for country, funk, that kind of thing, whereas humbuckers are used a lot in jazz and heavy metal because you need a warmer sound for the jazz, you know. So it's important in developing your tone, whichever pickup you want to use, you could probably base that off of what kind of artist you're trying to imitate. For example, if you really like Jimi Hendrix, get a Strat, you know, because that's what he used. But there are some other factors independent of whether you have single coil or humbucker. There's some other things you should think about that you can make adjustments on your guitar right now. So these other factors we talked about, the wood, the pickup, those are things to think about when you're buying a guitar. But now we're going to talk about some things you can do with whatever guitar you have right now. So one of the most important things you can adjust is the pickup height, how close it is to the strings, how far away it is from the strings. Generally, oh, hey, we got someone else. Let me add them in. We got Chris joining us. There we go. He should be joining us in a second. So pickup height, the main difference between pickup height, the higher your pickups are, the closer they are to the strings, you're going to get a lot more sustain. But if you put it too close to your strings, it's going to destroy your sustain. And that's because if it's so close that they're almost touching your strings when they vibrate, it's just going to ruin your whole sound. So you want generally your pickups as close as you can to the strings without them touching. If you put the pickups lower, you get less sustain. So you have to turn your amp up a lot louder to kind of make up for that. So a result of that is it happens to have a little bit more bite, a little bit more crispness to your noise. And so there are some guitarists that do that on purpose. They'll lower their pickups as low as they can get and then just turn their volume way up because they like the way that sounds. You could also tilt your pickups. Tilting your pickups will kind of change the EQ of your sound. If the pickups are higher on the bass end, you're obviously going to have more bass. If it's higher on the treble end, you're going to have a lot more treble going on. And so that can be helpful if you want, for example, you want a really warm, loud sustain for your lower chords, your power chords, but then you want more bite when you're playing your higher solo notes. So that's something you could think about trying out. Does anybody have any questions so far? I see Chris is joined us. How you doing, Chris? See a thumbs up. Okay, so another thing you can adjust on your pickups is you can adjust your pole height. Now, this isn't always adjustable. It's not adjustable on every guitar. The pole height is essentially the individual magnets, and you can adjust it for each string. And if it's closer to the string, it's going to be louder. If it's farther away, it's going to be quieter. Generally, you want your poles to be about the same distance all the way across, okay? And so this is more something to adjust when you first get your guitar. Just the way you would test that is you would play your strings one at a time. And if you hear a string that just is louder or extra quiet, you would just adjust your pole height. And you could also look at it visually, try to get them all about the same distance away from the strings. Again, that doesn't really affect your tone. It's more just making sure that all your strings have a nice, crisp, even sound. Before I go on any further, actually, I'm going to jump into the chat and I'm going to upload the document I made for this. Let me see if I can do that real quick. That way, if you guys want to follow along, you can. No, I don't see how I can do that. Actually, I'll do that toward, let me see. It's not giving me an option to upload a document this time. Yeah, last time I could upload a document, but this time it's not working. Oh, well. I'll find a way to upload it maybe towards the end of the lesson, or afterwards you can get it from Nick. We'll send it to everyone. But it's got it. So if you're taking notes, I also have this that I'll send out. It's got everything I'm talking about. Okay, so that's pickups. Next thing that's going to affect your tone, probably this next biggest factor is going to be your strings, the types of strings you use. Does anybody have a specific string set that they like love that they've been using, that they always have been using? Or maybe you just changed your strings and you have an example of the type you just threw on?
Normally use the Elixir,
Elixir? Okay, yeah.
yeah, but I try other ones all the time.
Yeah, Elixir is really good. When you're buying strings, there's basically 5 different factors that are going to affect how your strings sound. The first is going to be the gauge, the thickness of your strings. Just really simplifying it, the heavier the gauge, it's going to be it's going to have a louder, fatter sound. It's better for people who do a lot of strumming. It's good for slide playing because it's going to be tighter, and so it's easier to do the slide guitar. Also, drop tunings are better for the thicker gauges. If you're going to drop down your guitar to like drop A, you're definitely going to need some thick strings. And it's also good for unamplified acoustic playing because it's just louder because they're thicker. Lighter guitar strings are better for beginners just because they're a little bit easier to play. They're also good for blues and soloing because bends are really easy to do. Also, if you have a vintage guitar, one that's from the 60s, you want to take good care of it. You probably want to put lighter strings on it just to kind of it's because it has less force on the neck, so there's less of a chance of the neck breaking. So if you have an older guitar, keep that in mind. A hybrid gauge is kind of a mix between light and thick strings. The reason for that is you want kind of get the best of both worlds that way. Lighter strings are easier to play, whereas thicker strings are easier to have a lower setup with because they're thicker and so they vibrate less, and so it's easier to get them closer to the guitar. So if you're looking for just easy playing, try out a set of hybrid strings. They're really good. Another factor is the type of metal that your strings are made out of. For electric guitars, usually it's going to be nickel-plated steel, though there are companies that are coming out with a wide variety of strings. You can do pure nickel, you can do stainless steel. Cobalt is another one that's coming out. They all kind of affect your tone in different ways, so that's something you might want to look into. But generally, nickel-plated steel's got a good sound that most people are going to use. Acoustic guitars are almost always 80-20 bronze. The main difference with the acoustic guitar strings are the way they're coated, which we'll talk about in a second. Then classical guitar, if anybody plays classical guitar, those are usually just nylon strings. But you can get strings that are made from sheep intestines. So that's an option if you play classical guitar. The third factor of what you want to look at for strings is the type of core. The core is the string that goes through the middle, and then you have everything else wrapped around it. So the core, the most common is hex cores. These got like a hexagon shape. That they do that because it's easier to grip the wire, and it makes a more consistent tone, stronger attack, and a little bit brighter sound. That's pretty much all the strings you're going to find. You can also find round cores, and those are good to try out if you're trying to copy a vintage tone, because that's all there was before hex was invented more recently. So if you're going for something more vintage sounding, try the round core. Also, round core is a little bit easier to bend. They're a little bit more flexible, so that's something to think about also. We also have the winding method. This isn't super important for guitarists. Most guitarists are just going to have a wound strings. The winding method, it's talking about the strings that are wound around the core. Pretty much all the strings you're going to play, they're going to be wound. There's going to be round strings wrapped around a round core. If you play bass guitar, you might want to look at flat wound, and it just makes it really smooth. It has less string noise when you move your fingers along it because it's smooth and flat, but it has a lot less sustain. So that's something. And then the elixirs you were talking about, the fifth factor is string coatings. The Elixir invented string coatings. They put, I can't remember what type of material, but they coat the strings in like a plastic, and it makes them last longer, but it kind of reduces the brightness of the strings. So they can be really good for if you want good, long-lasting strings that don't have as much finger squeak. But again, it does reduce the brightness a little bit. So it's just something to think about. Anytime you buy a new set of strings, make sure to get your guitar set up by a professional. A guitar setup is basically them adjusting your neck, your pickup, like not your pickups, the bridge and the nut and everything, so that your strings are set at a comfortable distance away from the guitar. You want to do that, especially when you're trying out different gauges. For example, I'm going to try a new set of gauges, and I'm going to have to adjust the neck and everything to kind of match that. Because if you put a heavier gauge on, you're going to be pulling on the strings more, which means the neck is going to bend a little bit more. So you got to adjust it with the tension rod. So If you don't know how to do a setup, definitely take it to a professional anytime you get new strings on it, because that's going to make sure your guitar sounds nice and good and clear. So that's strings. If nobody has any questions about that, we'll jump into electronic configurations. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about the different knobs and controls that you have on the actual guitar itself. So we talked about what it's made out of. We talked about your pickups. We talked about your strings. Those are all huge factors in what's going to make your guitar sound like your guitar. Now your electronic configurations is going to allow you to customize your sound further. So let me grab my guitar. So on a guitar, you have volume knob, you have your tone knob, and you have your pickup switch. So you can decide which pickup you want to use. We're not going to talk too much about the volume knob. It's pretty straightforward. You can just turn your volume up and down. The volume knob is great if you're using distortion, because then you can higher or lower your distortion with your volume knob. But I do want to talk about the tone knob. Now the tone knob, not very many guitarists actually use the tone knob. In fact, I've heard a lot of guitarists say they wish the tone knob just didn't exist because it's just there and they don't use it. And that's because a lot of guitarists, especially beginners, don't really understand what the tone knob is for. So I just want to go over real quick what that does. The tone knob essentially is adjusting the tone. Like, I don't know how to explain it any clearer. It just kind of adjusts the EQ sound of your amp. So for example, I'm going to play real quick my guitar, just a flat. I'm going to set my tone to a 5, just right in the middle. And this is what it sounds like. All right, now I'm going to turn my tone all the way off. You notice how all the way off it was immediately just muddy, hard to hear the different notes. It was just just a wall of sound. I'm going to turn my tone all the way up now. It's a lot crisper. You can hear all the individual notes of the chord. It's just brighter and crisper. So essentially, turning your tone knob down makes your guitar sound warmer, and turning it up makes your guitar sound brighter. And so it's really good to set your tone knob at 5, right in the middle, before you do anything else with your amp or anything. You know, when you're setting the EQ on your amp, set your EQ on the amp based off of a 5 tone knob. Because then if you're performing, if you're playing a guitar solo, you turn your tone knob up to get a little bit extra punch. And then when you're playing the backing, the rhythm, you turn your tone knob down just so you stay in the background a little bit more, so you're not as crisp and you let somebody else take over. And that's essentially what the tone knob does. It's really useful to have. So play around with it, and it'll definitely do you some good. The other thing that you want to think about is which pickups to use. Again, a lot of guitarists, beginner guitarists especially, are wondering, like, which pickups should I be using? Why should I be using that pickup? Essentially, when you're setting the EQ on your guitar, on your amp, you want your pickup set to the middle, so you're using all your pickups. If you want a brighter tone for lead guitar, you use the bridge pickup, and if you want a warmer tone, you use the neck pickup. So that's mainly the big difference. It's just something you got to play around with. You do want to use different ones depending on your playing situation. And if you're really not sure, just use all of them. Just set it in the middle, use them all. Does anybody have any questions about that? How to use the tone knob, EQ, not EQ, which pickup to use?
No.
No, good, okay. Pretty straightforward. So that's pretty much everything you can adjust on your actual guitar. There's not much else you can do to adjust your tone. If you want to get rid of feedback, there's some coatings you can put on the inside of your electric guitar to kind of to protect the electronics from sending out feedback, but you don't really need to do that. That's just another option. So that's basically everything: the wood, the pickups, the strings, and then controlling your electronics. That's all there is to do with the guitar itself. So now let's look at your amp that you're using. Now, if you're playing acoustic guitar, this isn't going to affect you very much. There's 2 different types of amps that we use. We got solid state amps and tube amps. Do you guys know what type of amp you have? If you have a solid state or a tube amp?
I have a tube.
Okay, you have a tube amp. That's nice.
Solid state. Solid state.
You got solid state. Nice. Okay. Solid states are the most common and they're the most affordable. whereas tube amps are a little bit more vintage and they're a little bit more expensive. They're a lot of people regard tube amps as the epitome of good tone just because they love the way good tube amps sound. But solid state amps are just now becoming just as good as tube amps because they basically copy the way a tube amp sounds. Even then, if you're a purist, you'll say that nothing's like a tube amp. In my personal opinion, if you get a good solid state, it's going to sound just as good as a tube amp. Then again, I don't have too much experience with tube amps, so I can't really say for sure. I do want to get my hands on a tube amp pretty soon. Tube amps, you do have to replace the tubes. They basically look like light bulbs. You have to replace those every now and again. So it is a little bit more expensive to maintain, and they're a little bit more delicate. But other than that, either one is a good option. If you're in the market for buying a new amp, one thing you should think about is the speaker size. Now, generally, the speaker size, you're going to want your speakers to be 12 inches. That's basically the standard that pretty much everyone uses, because that gives yourself a good balance of the power handling and harmonic complexity of the sound coming out of it. But you can do different sizes to get different tones. For example, a smaller speaker, like a 10-inch, is going to be crisper, and it's going to have less boom when you're playing on a small stage. Whereas a bigger speaker is going to move the air more easily, and so you're going to have more detailed noise, more detailed highs and lows, but it's going to sound boomier. So there's a little bit of a drawback for each of those. So you can try either one, or if you're not sure, just go with a 12-inch speaker. That's pretty much the standard. On my amp, I have two 12-inch speakers. I wish it only had one 12-inch speaker. There's really no benefit to having multiple speakers unless you're trying to be louder. And I kind of hate having two 12-inch speakers because it just makes my amp so big and I have to carry it around everywhere for the gigs, and it's just really heavy. So eventually here I want to get one 12-inch speaker in my amp, a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to handle. Okay, so now let's talk about EQ. Now this is probably the most important thing that we can talk about in this entire class, especially if you're an electric guitarist, is how to use the EQ on your amp. Now this is a huge issue for a lot of beginner guitarists. Essentially on your EQ, you have three different parameters that you can change. You have the lows, the mids, and the highs. And they just change. I'll just demonstrate to you what they sound like. I'm not even going to try and explain it to you. So here's my amp. I got everything set. I got my tone knob at 5. I'm using both pickups, and I got it set so that it's got a flat sound. Everything's set to the middle. Everything's at 5. All right, here's what it sounds like. Okay, so now I'm going to turn up my bass. You can hear how right there it just sounded bassier. It sounded more like had more sound coming out of it. Here's what the treble sounds like all the way up. It's a lot crisper, a lot clearer, the noise coming out of it. And then here's the middle sound, the mid set all the way up. For me, that kind of muddles the sound together is what the mids does. So the bass turns your bassier noises up, the highs turn your high frequencies up, and then the mids kind of make it muddier by turning everything together. Really, to get a good sound out of your amp, the process you should go through is after you set your tone knob to 5, set your EQ everything to 5, and then just play around by turning one parameter up slightly and one parameter down, okay? And just kind of play around with how that sounds. Every amp handles EQ differently, so I can't really give you a set EQ, like this is what your highs, lows, and mids should be set to, because it's going to be different. Every amp is going to handle it differently. And so you really have to play around with your amp. And if you ever get a new amp, you're going to have to play around with that amp to get used to how it handles EQ. So the EQ I like to use with my amp right now is I like to have my treble set up just a little bit higher, like around 7. And then I turn my mids and my lows down to about 4. Just very slight adjustments. I didn't move anything that far away from the middle. Because I'm already getting the tone I like with my strings, my wood, everything else is creating the tone I like. The EQ is just to add on to that to make it a little bit more special. And so here's what the EQ I like sounds like. So that works for my sound. It's got a little bit more crispness, and then it kind of, since the bass and mids are a little bit lower, it stays out of the way for the bass player to be able to play and have his footprint in the song. So that's just what I like. Again, I can't say that'll work for you. You got to try it on your amp, see what it sounds like. Okay, and that's the biggest thing. Just listen. You could spend the rest of your life working on just trying to figure out how to do EQ, because there's a lot of other factors that can get involved. Like if you're playing with your amp in a small little club, it's going to sound different than if you're somewhere else with different walls and different ceilings. Like if you're playing in a room that has lots of carpet, it's going to pick up the high frequencies more, and so you're going to have a warmer sound. But then if you go play somewhere that has a lot of like windows, you're going to have the highs are going to be more prominent, and so you'll have to adjust your amp, your EQ settings depending on where you're playing even. And so it just takes a lot of time to kind of get used to that and be able to pick that up. So start now. Don't just ignore EQ. Definitely start now to play with it if you don't already do that. All right. Now I'm going to talk about, that's pretty much everything I can talk about that. We're going to go on to connections and further amplification real quick. We got a couple more minutes left. So the biggest thing I want to say here is make sure that your connections you're using are good quality cables. Okay. You want to make sure your 1/4 inch cables are good. They're high quality. You'll have to replace them every couple of years probably, just because they do start to deteriorate over time. So make sure you get yourself a good quality cable. That being said, you don't need to buy the most expensive cable in the world. For example, I was looking at this earlier. I'm going to share my screen again real quick. I was looking at different, I'll let that go out of the way. No, not that one. There it is. This Mogami Platinum guitar cable for $239.95. There are people that claim that having this $200 guitar cable makes their guitar sound better than anyone else, but I think that's just not true. You don't need to spend that much on a guitar cable. If you spend, I'd say like $30 on a good cable is probably enough. What you're doing with the cable is you're not trying to make your sound better. You're just trying to retain the sound that you already have. And so if you put a really bad cable in your guitar, it's not going to preserve the amazing tone you've been developing. So get a high quality cable so that can deliver it, but don't fall for the $200 trap. Let's see. Also, make sure you have good power supply. This is good, especially for if you use batteries for like your preamp in your acoustic guitar. If you have an acoustic electric, make sure you have a good brand new battery in your guitar. If your battery starts to lose power, your tone is going to start to deteriorate. So you need good quality power sent to everything. And that applies to your amp too. I would put my amps, pedals, everything plugged into a surge protector, because that protects it if there is a surge. And then it just helps to make sure that there's a good flow of electricity going on. Pedals can use batteries, or they can plug straight into a surge protector. I'd say use a plug, don't use batteries. That's because you save a lot of money because you don't have to buy a bunch of batteries. And 2, you don't have to worry about switching them out every show. Because again, even on those, if your battery starts to die, your tone's going to go with it. So make sure you have a good quality power source going for everything. If possible, just replace your battery every time you play. Last thing I want to talk about, because we're running out of time, is if you're playing an actual gig, how to amplify your sound for the whole venue. There's 2 ways you can do this. You can do this by miking your amp or miking your guitar, or you can do it with a direct input box. And so if you're in charge of doing this, do some research to figure out what you need to do. Otherwise, the sound engineer at whatever venue you're playing at will probably know what you need. A microphone is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of things that go into it, but you're just putting a mic on your amp or on your guitar. But a direct input box is something not very many people know about. The purpose of a direct input box is to take an unbalanced signal and turn it into a balanced signal to go to the PA system. Now, what do I mean by balanced, unbalanced? An unbalanced signal is any 1/4 inch cable. Any 1/4 inch cable that you have, any guitar cable, is an unbalanced signal, and unbalanced signals are going to produce extra noise and extra hum. Whereas a balanced signal, it's got an extra ground wire going through it, and it sends the signal back and forth or something like that. I'm not an engineer, so I don't remember exactly how it works. But a balanced signal, it clears out that noise, makes your guitar sound a lot clearer and a lot better. And so to plug into a PA system, you're going to want a balanced signal going to your PA system. So a direct input box is essentially an adapter that goes in the middle. You plug your guitar amp into it, your guitar plug into it, and then an XLR, a mic cable comes out the other end to send it to the PA system. If you play acoustic guitar, you're definitely going to want to get a direct input box. A DI box is what it's called. If you play electric guitar, the only reason you would need that is if you have a preamp in your pedals and you don't want to bring your amp to the gig. Then you should get a direct input box so you can go direct to the PA system. Otherwise, you'll probably just end up miking everything. And a DI box is only like $20. Honestly, you don't need anything expensive. A $20 DI box will do what you need. So yeah, that's basically everything that goes into everything I thought of. There are definitely more factors that go into affecting your guitar tone. You'll be spending probably the rest of your music career trying to figure out how to get good tone. This is something you will spend a long time on. You can't just spend a few hours trying to figure it out and done. You're going to be experimenting all your musical career trying to figure this out. I'm still trying to figure out how to get an even better tone, just playing around with the different factors. So before we end here, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
So I want to talk about the DI box.
Okay.
And so I have a new PA. I have a new Yamaha PA system, a Yamaha Stage Pass 1000.
Okay.
And what I really need a DI box for that, it has an equalizer on it. It's a very sophisticated equalizer. And if I'm running balanced cables into it, would I actually need a DI box to interface to that?
Okay, so what are you planning to plug into it? Your guitar, I assume?
Well, I'm plugging. Right now I have my mic going into it.
Okay, your mic doesn't need a DI box. Your mic,
Okay.
Your mic cable is already a balanced signal.
And then I have two guitars that I play my electric guitar through it because it has. And I'm no engineer. It has a high Z frequency on it.
Okay.
Be able to carry those pickups on the electric guitar,
Okay.
as opposed to the simplicity of the pickups on the acoustic guitar.
Okay.
So it's able to drive the Stratocaster or the Telecaster with no problem.
Gotcha. It probably sounds fine. It's not the most important thing, but if you're using a cable like this, it is an unbalanced signal.
Okay.
I mean, there are a few cables like this that are balanced, but even if you're using a balanced cable, if your guitar is not sending out a balanced signal, it's not going to do you any good. So you have to send a balanced signal through a balanced cable for it to work.
Okay.
And so my recommendation is if you are plugging your guitar directly into it, do get a DI box. In fact, I'll show you, I'll share my screen real quick. This is one that I found that's just $19.99. You can get, you don't need anything fancy. You plug your cable into here. It has two inputs because you can actually plug your guitar into one of them and then the other one can go out to your amp. That way you're going straight into the system and also to your amp so you can hear yourself on stage. And then the other end of it, that's where your XLR, your mic cable comes out to go into the PA system. It's just, it has to do with those three prongs. One of those is a grounding cable, and so it balances out the sound. So when you're playing, if you notice that your guitar has a slight hum, it's probably because it's not a balanced signal. Okay. So if you want to get rid of that hum, any extra noise, that's what you got to do is just get a DI box.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Great.
yeah, not absolutely necessary, but it's good. Any other questions?
I think that's it for me.
Yeah. Looks like nope, no other questions. Then, oh yeah.
No, good.
Oh, you're good. Everyone's good. Okay, sounds good. I couldn't figure out how to send it up to the chat, the document I made, so I'll send it to Nick, and he should be able to upload it. He'll email you guys with the link to it probably. So, all right. Well, if there's no other questions, it's awesome talking to you guys. Hopefully you picked something up out of that and enjoyed it a bit. All right.
Yeah.